advertising meetings to discuss a plan set in motion 74 years ago to control the population of unwanted citizens, including African Americans.
Mark Holmberg went to one of the meetings in the East End tonight. Here's his report and commentary.
There can be little question that the Negro Project, started in 1939 by Margaret Sanger, changed the complexion of America.
The Negro Project, as it has been labeled, was a strategic effort of socioeconomic cleansing. Some have labeled it scientific racism, the attempt to wipe out minority pockets of peoples.
Despite the controversy stirred up by the Negro Project billboards, tonight's seminar at Mount Olivet Church about the push to slow reproduction of, quote, unfit members of society saw the pews only about half full.
I think the ultimate goal was to slow down and to retard the growth of blacks, the population of blacks in America.
Margaret Sanger, the godmother of Planned Parenthood, was the fearless voice for birth control, a woman who thought charity weakened society. She was an early champion of gay rights, of women's rights, of abstinence and chastity. She believed diseases, mental illness, and poverty could be eased by negative eugenics, trying to keep those inferiors from reproducing.
Early on, when it was, illegal, of course, for abortion, then the emphasis was to push strongly, contraception. But then beyond that, the push began to be sterilization.
It's a tough chapter of history where social engineers here and in Nazi Germany were joined by the science of eugenics. In essence, selectively breeding humans like we do farm animals and pets to get rid of the traits we don't want and promote the ones we do.
Certainly within the black community, it's easy to look at census data and know that we are no longer the largest minority group in this country. And people could argue that that's an issue of immigration, but I think part of that is that there are easily 17 million that are not here, and if those had children, how many more people would there be?
This tough history has a modern message in the politics of abortion and reproductive rights. Margaret Sanger is a fascinating character in American history. She was very much against abortion and did a lot to promote health in the black community. Both her and her Negro Project are a little too complicated to boil down to a 2-minute news broadcast. Hope you get a chance to read about them at Mount Olivet Church in the East End. Mark Holmberg, CBS 6 News.
Story concerns abortion and began, strangely enough, in this relatively peaceful suburb of Los Angeles. Malvin Weisberg, a pathologist, owned a large storage container which he kept in his backyard. When he failed to make the final 2 payments, it was repossessed.
We made a decision to repossess it because his check did not clear the bank, and so we sent the truck out to pick up the container.
I rolled out there and took the box up and started pulling it up. And it was so heavy, it broke the winch.
And we couldn't get it off the trailer, so we had to leave it on the trailer because it was too heavy. So I was asked by Nick to have a crew go down and unload the container at the other yard.
I got a radio call from Ron Gillette, the foreman, and he said the men were throwing up and there was something really wrong.
One of them fell down and hit me right in front of my feet. And it was opened up, and there it was. It was a mutilated body. And the more closer I looked at it, it was a human body.
And when I came to work the following day, I saw myself. I couldn't believe it. And just little bitty babies, just all torn in pieces. My heads chopped off, arms, legs, it just makes you sick to see something like that. Well, it really just, it makes you want to cry when you see something like that.
Starting at the very front of this container, it was just wall clear to the ceiling and clear to the sides, filled with them.
I really don't want to witness it again. Not what I saw.
Well, as the supervisor for the county of Los Angeles, we found out through the through the media that 17,000 infants had been stored in a container. So we asked for an investigation by the district attorney and the coroner's office. We found approximately 190 were over 20 weeks of age. I think some as old as 25, 27 weeks.
Mr. Antonovich contacted Mr. Gutierrez.
Glenn Wong is a funeral director for a major Los Angeles mortuary.
Asked us to go ahead and handle the burial of the fetuses. How I came involved was they were asking if it were possible to have anyone photograph these fetuses, and I so happened to be also a photographer.
How many fetuses were actually involved in the autopsies?
There were approximately about 44, if I'm correct.
And why were the autopsies performed?
They were to find out why, or what was the reason of the cause of death.
That wasn't apparent?
Apparently not. No, I've seen some of these fetuses, and believe me, they were apart. There were some where the eyes were bulging, and some where the chest cavity was ripped open. I do remember one where I saw a hand and the feet all apart. So it was kind of like the hands were intact, the feet were intact, and everything else was more like just a little potpourri, a little of everything, and that was it. That kind of turned me.
Here we see the abortionist stretching the cervix very wide open.
Dr. John Wilkie, who with his wife Barbara authored The Handbook on Abortion, described the dilation and extraction method used to abort many of the fetuses.
That without any anesthetic, the abortionist reaches up into the womb and seizes part of the body of the baby, usually a leg or an arm, twisting and tearing, tears it off and away from the body of the baby. The baby, feeling pain, does not have any anesthetic. Bleeding is extreme. The abortionist returns in there with this grasping pliers-like instrument, tearing more parts of the body away, snapping the spine, and finally the mechanical problem is to get the skull out, and so he usually has to crush the skull in order to bring it out.
We had a court order that we would allow us to bury these infants, being a humane act. And the ACLU comes in again saying that this is just tissue. We want to incinerate them, and there's no need for a burial. Because if you had a burial, somehow that's going to create a problem. Problem for whom?
And at that time, I think everybody there realized this was wrong, that it was really wrong. Everybody standing there felt that way. Even the coroner's office, I could sense that they were treating this like they were dead people, and they are dead people. That's the way everybody treated it. Evidently, the ACLU doesn't feel that way. And then transferred it all into to the original container, and as I understand, it's still up in a county yard someplace.
Is it refrigerated?
No, it's in a steel container.
And how long, do you have any idea how long it'll be there?
I don't know, but it's been 2 years now, so who knows?
Although the discovery of 17,000 fetuses in a trash container is not an everyday occurrence, it is an event that should surprise no one. For every 3 days, an equivalent number of fetal children are disposed of in this country. 17,000.
And now to our story. When Mrs. Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States back in 1916, birth control was a dirty word. The police threw her into jail, as they were to do 7 more times during her crusade, a crusade that still faces the reasoning but unalterable opposition of the Roman Catholic Church. That crusade kept Mrs. Sanger away from her children for long periods. It helped to break up her first marriage, and she suffered constant, harrowing social abuse. Mrs. Sanger, in view of all of that, let me ask you this first of all. Why did you do it? I realize that you had an intellectual conviction that birth control was a boon to mankind, but I'm sure that others have that conviction too. And so what I'd like to know is this. What events, what emotions in your life made Margaret Sanger a crusader for birth control?
Well, Mr. Wallace, it's hard to say that any one thing has made one do this or that. I think from the very beginning, I came with a large family. My mother died young, 11 children. That made an impression on me as a child. I was a trained nurse, went among the people, I saw women who asked to have some means whereby they wouldn't have to have another pregnancy too early after the last child, the last abortion, which many of them had. So there's a number of things that are one after the other that really made you feel that you had to do something.
There are some other possible reasons that suggest themselves on reading your biography by Lawrence later. Your mother, as you say, died prematurely after bearing 11 children. She was born a Catholic, was she not?
She was born a Catholic, yes.
And
in Ireland.
Your father was a sort of a village atheist who clashed with church authorities, and because of his atheism, his earnings dwindled under community pressure. You and your brothers and sisters were known as, quote, children of the devil, end quote. Could it be then that in part at least you were driven emotionally toward the birth control movement because of antagonism toward the church, because that was a way to fight the church?
No, I don't think I had anything of the kind in mind. I was what I would call a born humanitarian. I don't like to see people suffer. I don't like to see cruelty, even to this day. And in nursing, you see a great deal of cruelty and unnecessary suffering. At that time, there was no opposition as far as the church was concerned. Any church. It was mainly the law, the federal law and state laws that one had to think of. The church was not in my mind at all.
Well, in going after your motive then, and I will press you just a little bit more about that and then get to the specifics of this evening, but in your motive, in the movement, is it possible that the movement itself, the feeling of wanting to do anything that you felt was important, that perhaps that moved you a good deal? Because the fact remains that you led a movement against overwhelming pressures that stemmed back for centuries, and in doing so, according to your autobiography, you even left your first husband. And you wrote this to a friend, Mrs. Sanger. You said, "Where is the man to give me what the movement gives in joy and interest and freedom?" Now, what was this joy, this freedom that you craved?
Well, I don't remember that letter, who it was written, but I think that it was not a question of marriage at all. There was a certain satisfaction in doing something that was going to alleviate the sufferings of women in particular, and I was quite a feminist at the time.
Obviously.
And yes, and I naturally didn't want to see women take all the suffering of childbearing and of pregnancies. So it was a pleasure in a sense to think that you were striking at an archaic law, which it was. It's put on the statute books by Anthony Comstock some years ago, and no one had stood up against it. No one had tried to change the laws. And at that time, not even a doctor had a right to use the United States mails and common carriers for books, for learning, for anything that he had to do with this question. It was considered obscene. The whole question was considered obscene.
Mrs. Sanger, you have helped to spread the birth control movement not only here in the United States, but in Europe and the Orient as well. Why? Why is birth control of such vital importance internationally? Is it just to save women suffering? Is that the only reason in your mind?
Well, not entirely. The population question is a great concern today, and the rate at which the births come in to we're saving them now. At one time, when children died, they didn't have the food. Today, our population all over the world is getting certainly better consideration and better conditions than they had at the time that I was there. I went to every country because I was invited. And I didn't go into the country myself. I was invited to go to Japan and to speak there, have 8 lectures on the question of birth control and peace.
Well, do you believe that birth control is essential if we want to keep millions of people across the world from starving? Is that your thesis?
Say it again.
Do you feel that birth control is essential to keep millions of people across the world from starving?
Well, I think the birth control, if you keep your population more or less static until you pick up your resources, certainly you'll keep prevent their starving.
Well, what's more important, birth control or picking up the resources?
Well, picking up the resources, there's just a limit to that, too. There's just so much. Take Japan. And she cannot feed. They've had the best experts come there when MacArthur was there. And the best experts say that they have 20 million more people than they can feed. She's got to be fed outside, and in some way, she's got to have that kind of help if she's going to keep from fighting.
But certainly around the world there is potential agricultural land that is not being properly used now. Just this past year, on May 21st, the New York Times summarized an important study of the world's food resources made by Professor James Bonner of the California Institute of Technology. Professor Bonner says the world is not using 1 billion acres of potential agricultural land, and he adds that if this land were used and present agricultural land were improved, the entire world could be fed adequately even if the population increased by 1/3 in the next 50 years.